Yeah, welcome to this UF Malmo lecture. UF Malmo, we usually do lectures every week or so. We do lectures on anything related to foreign affairs. So it can be, economics, human rights, conflicts. Today we have a lecture about Israel. Just some practical information. Everybody's muted. If you want to ask questions, we're going to have a Q&A section after like 30 minutes. And then if you want to ask a question, then just raise your hand or write in the chat, and I will unmute you. Yeah. And you can also follow UF Malmo on Instagram and Facebook to see where we have our lectures. Just UF Malmo on all social media. And yeah, with that said, we have Alex McDonald here today, journalist, who is gonna hold this lecture.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this, and thank you all for turning up to listen. Yeah, my name's Alex McDonald. I'm a reporter and a commentator, and I've been writing about and doing other sorts of media about the Middle East as a whole for the last 10 years, and obviously the question of Israel-Palestine is central to the whole region, and has been for around more than 100 years, arguably. So I'm going to give this lecture today. It is a bit polemical. It's probably somewhat subjective. It's based on my own understanding of the situation there and of the recent developments there, and of the kind of the politics and the social questions around the region as I understand them and as I've reported on them. And obviously there are many Palestinian and Israeli journalists out there who probably could give a more personal and impassioned and more insightful speech on the subject, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So it appears that we may finally be seeing the end of the age of Netanyahu. As Israel's longest-serving prime minister, it has become increasingly hard to imagine a world without him. Netanyahu's term in office saw the liberal defenders of Israel, both internationally and domestically, throw their hands up in horror. Israel, long touted as an oasis of secularism, rationalism, women's rights and democracy in a sea of tyranny and fanaticism in the Middle East, has under Netanyahu increasingly become a state that projected an air of militarism that allied with disreputable regimes that ran roughshod over human rights and agitated against its Arab citizens. For liberal observers, the nadir of this was the passage of the nation-state law in 2018, which made de jure what had long been de facto in Israel, that the state was a state for the Jewish people exclusively, not a state for all its citizens, let alone for all of those living under its control. As it currently stands, and following political dealings right up to last night's deadline to form a government, the new Prime Minister of Israel looks set to be Naftali Bennett, leader of the Yamina, or New Right party, and former defense minister. Politically, Bennett has his roots in the settler movement, who have, since Israel's conquest of the West Bank, Golan Heights, East Jerusalem and Gaza in 1967, spread in their hundreds of thousands throughout the occupied territories, in violation of international law and often even Israeli law. In an interview on Al Jazeera in 2017, Bennett cited the Bible as the basis for Israel's right to sovereignty over the land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. And he's spoken many other times in frank terms about the Jewish people's divine right to rule in the Holy Land in its entirety. For liberal supporters of Israel, the idea that the prime minister of their country could wield the scripture as justification for power might come as a shock. as might his frank boasting of killing Arabs during his military service, his opposition to LGBT rights, and, perhaps most importantly, his open and unequivocal opposition to the creation of a Palestinian state. But for others, the rise to power of Bennett makes plain and overt something which has been implicit for decades, that the state of Israel is a state of settlers whose justification for rule over the land of historic Palestine is based on religious justification, and that Jewish settlement of the land takes priority over concerns about human rights, democracy, social equality, or self-determination. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 saw the expulsion of nearly 800,000 Palestinians from their homes in what they refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe. Between 1948 and 1966, the Palestinians that remained in what had become the State of Israel were kept under military rule, subject to arbitrary detention, expulsion, and the forced seizure of their land. After the war in 1967 with neighbouring Arab states, Israel took control of Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, though Sinai was returned after a deal with Egypt in 1979. Millions of Palestinians in these territories have been subjected to the rule of occupation until the present day, denied any democratic or civil rights over the state that controls their lives. Whether under a self-declared socialist and atheist, like the founding Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, or an Orthodox Jewish theocrat and free market advocate like Naftali Bennett, the Israeli state has always subjected the majority of the Palestinian populace under its control to military rule, and has sought to maintain the hegemony of the Jewish populace. This new coalition government, which is proposed by former TV host and leader of the so-called centrist Yesh Atid party, Yair Lapid, is being described in some circles as a national unity government, encompassing, as it does, parties from the far right of Israeli politics, such as Bennett's or Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu, to the Labour Party and Meretz, which are nominally on the left of Israeli politics. It is also likely to include, most notably, the United Arab List, a Palestinian Islamist organisation who would be the first Arab party in government for many decades, having broken with the larger pro-Palestinian Joint List coalition in Israel over that group's commitment to secularism and progressive social values. With the possible exception of the United Arab List, there are two things which unite all these parties: opposition to Netanyahu and support for the maintenance of Israel as a Jewish state. In the last 2 years, Israel has gone to the polls 4 times, and each time there has not been a decisive victory. However, in all of these elections, the question of the Palestinians has been virtually absent. In the day-to-day politics of Israel, there is often little thought paid to the question of the return to negotiations over a future Palestinian state. The fact that even Meretz, supposedly the political representative of Israel's now tiny peace camp, is willing to join a government led by Naftali Bennett is indicative of how little the question of the occupation or the creation of a Palestinian state registers in Israeli political discourse. Among the Palestinians in the occupied territories, the sense of political despair over the question of statehood is even more pronounced. Since 1993, following the Oslo Peace Accords, Palestinians in the occupied territories were supposed to enjoy a degree of self-rule under the Palestinian Authority as a backdrop to negotiations over the creation of a Palestinian state. Today, however, the Palestinian Authority is largely seen as, at best, ineffectual and corrupt, and at worst, an authoritarian proxy for the Israeli security services. Rather than being about self-governance, the Palestinian Authority has been a means for the Israelis to outsource management of the occupied territories, while being able to claim Palestinians have political sovereignty and are, therefore, at least equally to blame when political negotiations fail. President Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, has long outstayed his mandate, and while the PA claims the decision to once again cancel long overdue elections in April was due to their inability to hold polls in East Jerusalem, many saw it as a depressingly predictable move on the part of an elite who fear losing the privileged position handed to them by Israel and by the international community. The failure of the PA was highlighted by their virtual invisibility during the recent protest in Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and around the Al-Aqsa mosque, as well as the subsequent fighting in Gaza. There are those who have subsequently again called for the Oslo Accords and the PA to be dissolved. to return the occupied territories to full Israeli control and remove, finally, the illusion of sovereignty. But despite the apparent collapse of the Oslo peace process, the world powers appear incapable of adjusting to reality. During a visit to Israel-Palestine at the end of May, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken stuck meticulously to the same script that virtually every US administration has stuck to for the last 30 years. He reiterated absolute US support for Israel's security. He spoke of bolstering support for the PA, he spoke of isolating Hamas while helping rebuild Gaza, and he issued statements of regret for losses on all sides. He also described a two-state solution as the only way forward for maintaining Israel's status as a Jewish and democratic state. Now, after the Trump years, there are some who see this as a welcome return to normality. Trump did not give even the slightest impression of impartiality on the conflict, robustly and vocally supporting Israel's ambitions while fully disregarding the Palestinians. His much-touted 2017 deal of the century gave the Israelis everything they wanted, with little or no concessions to the Palestinians, who were not even consulted on its development. When it comes to American foreign policy, though, the Trump administration's main legacy is perhaps just a willingness to say the quiet part loud. America has spent decades defending Israel in the international arena under both Democratic and Republican presidents. Over the past 5 decades, the United States has vetoed at least 53 UN Security Council resolutions critical of Israel, despite the fact that the US officially recognizes the illegality of the settlement construction in the occupied territories. In 2016, shortly before he left office, Barack Obama caused a stir when he instructed the US to abstain, for a change, on a Security Council resolution condemning settlement building. The move led to an outcry from pro-Israel supporters, including from Morton Klein, the head of the Zionist Organization of America, who branded Obama a, quote, Jew-hating anti-Semite. Under Biden, it seems the US has returned to form. During the latest round of violence in Gaza, the US repeatedly blocked Security Council statements condemning Israeli attacks on Gaza and calling for a ceasefire from both sides. During the fighting, Biden chose to maintain contact with Abbas and the PA, despite their apparent irrelevance to either the Gaza fighting or the situation in Jerusalem. Blinken's visit has also been aimed at boosting the PA as the representatives of the Palestinian people, despite their illegitimacy in the eyes of so many Palestinians, particularly those involved in the protests around Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah. At the same time, Biden has spoken about the need to, once again, reignite the so-called peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. With Trump out, the US administration has returned to its favorite non-solution to the crisis. An endless one-sided round of negotiations in which unrepresentative Palestinian leaders are pressed to make more and more concessions, with a Godot-like Palestinian state always promised just around the corner. The Oslo Accords, negotiated by US President Bill Clinton between then Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1993, have become a farce, if they ever held any legitimacy. The peace process has seen the Palestinian leadership give up their right to the vast majority of their historic homeland in exchange for the vague promise of a sovereign state somewhere down the line. At the time of the Oslo Accords in 1993, Palestinian academic Edward Said described them as an instrument of Palestinian surrender, pointing out that Israel had effectively conceded nothing beyond recognizing Arafat's Palestinian Liberation Organization as the official representatives of the Palestinian people. In the following years, the so-called peacemaker Rabin allowed a massive expansion in the construction of illegal settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, making a Palestinian state increasingly unviable, even as he dangled the prospect of one in front of Arafat and his negotiating team. And while the establishment of the PA gave the Palestinians a degree of autonomy, albeit arguably no more than that was held by the rulers of the Bantustans of apartheid South Africa, the Oslo Accords also legitimized Israeli control in the occupied territories, rendering them disputed rather than illegally captured territories captured through a war of conquest. As of 2021, Israel still controls all of the West Bank and directly administers more than 60% of it, leaving less than 10% of the West Bank and Gaza under limited Palestinian control. For decades, Palestinians and others in the developing world, including South African democracy campaigners, have described the situation in Israel-Palestine as one of apartheid. Because Palestinian political advocacy is so often seen as illegitimate, suspect, or even downright sinister in so much of the Western world, there has been little take-up on this in establishment circles until recently. But the decision this year by the Israeli NGO B'Tselem and America's Human Rights Watch to label the situation apartheid has caused more of a stir. The acknowledgement that there is a state that exists across the land of historic Palestine, which denies almost half the population of the region's civil and democratic rights, and that state can be considered apartheid, as defined by the UN, is becoming more and more mainstream. The only Western country that seems to have recognised the reality on the ground to any real extent is Ireland, who last month, the only Western country that is, who last month became the first EU country to recognise Israel's de facto annexation of the West Bank. After 55 years of Israeli control of the occupied territories, at least one Western government has finally acknowledged that Israel probably isn't leaving. But across the rest of the world, governments have stuck to the illusion of a peace process that has not formally existed in any real sense since 2014, and which has arguably always been a smokescreen to legitimize Israel's continued expansion. Worse, perhaps, is the growing attempts by some Western governments at the moment to actively stamp out the pro-Palestinian movement, which has been growing in size and numbers. In America, in the UK, and across Europe, national and local politicians have been legislating a crackdown on demonstrations and activism. Perhaps the biggest target of pro-Israel campaigners has been the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, or BDS. Founded in 2005 by Palestinian activist Omar Barghouti and other civil society campaigners in Palestine, the BDS movement has aimed to peacefully pressure Israel into following its obligations under international law in a similar fashion to the campaigns previously launched against apartheid South Africa. While one can debate the relative merits, effectiveness, and moral justification of BDS, and many Palestinians and Israelis do, the reaction from Israel and from allied governments has been one of authoritarian overreach. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson in December 2019 promised to bring forward legislation that would ban public bodies from implementing boycotts, specifically citing the risk of anti-Semitism and the targeting of Israel. Similar legislation has been proposed and implemented across some municipalities in Germany, while a law passed in France in 2003 banning discrimination based on national origin has also been used to target BDS campaigners. And of course, in the US, there have been numerous legal battles across the various states over laws introducing bans on BDS. Outside of BDS, France also banned pro-Palestine marches last month at the height of the unrest there, fearing it would stoke communal tensions, and arrested the head of the main French Palestine Solidarity Association. City authorities in Frankfurt also attempted a ban on a protest, though this was overturned by the courts. Much of the conflict over Palestinian activism in Europe and America, as well as in other countries like India and Myanmar, is tied up in the rising tide of Islamophobia and fears over Muslim immigration. Long-standing fears over immigration and anti-Muslim racism have pushed numerous right-wing politicians across the globe into the pro-Israel camp. For right-wingers, Israel has become something of a totem. Not only is it willing to use disproportionate violence to repress what they see as an internal fifth columnist threat, but the state vigorously and unapologetically defends its privileged national majority. And at the same time, the fact of Israel's status as the world's only Jewish state means that racist nationalist politicians can push accusations of anti-Semitism against the pro-Palestinian movement, painting them as, in fact, the real racists and delegitimizing their anti-racist campaigning. In the US as well, there is a strong religious current underpinning this. The evangelical Christian right, who have made up the basis of the Republican Party for many decades, adhere to apocalyptic myths about the return of the Jews to Israel, heralding Armageddon, a belief system that is tied up with a whole host of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic tropes. It is notable, after all, that the largest pro-Israel organization in the US is Christians United for Israel, rather than any Jewish organization. By comparison, Jewish communities in the US, which are generally Democrat voting and left-leaning, have become increasingly uncomfortable about Israeli actions, and younger Jewish activists in particular have become more and more vocally pro-Palestinian, framing their activism as a continuity of the anti-racist struggle fought by their forebears against European anti-Semitism. Just a second. In some ways, the fighting we saw last month across Israel-Palestine was depressingly familiar. Israeli provocation around the Al-Aqsa mosque led to an outcry and protests which Israeli security services fiercely repressed. Hamas got involved by firing rockets, and the Israeli government launched a conflagration on Gaza, killing hundreds and leaving yet more of the territory in ruins. But the outcry over the Al-Aqsa mosque violations, and also the expulsion of families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, spread as well throughout the communities of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. That is, the Palestinians who were left in Israel after the creation of the state and were not expelled either into the diaspora or into refugee camps or into the occupied territories, and who hold Israeli citizenship. In Haifa, in Lid, in al-Fahm, in Nazareth and other cities and towns within Israel's 1948 borders, Palestinian citizens of Israel took to the streets in support of Palestinians in the occupied territories, often leading, unfortunately, to intercommunal violence. This is another reality which talk of a two-state solution ignores. The total failure of Israel to create an Arab-Israeli identity separate from the Palestinians. Though they have always been second-class citizens, the Palestinian citizens of Israel have long been held up by defenders of Israel as proof of the country's commitment to equality, highlighting their right to vote, their right to hold office, and their right to legal representation. This comes up even in spite of the passage of the nation-state law in 2018, which makes Palestinians de jure second-class citizens rather than de facto. But the uprisings we've seen across Israel by the Palestinian minority 73 years after the creation of the state, prove that the line between Palestinians with Israeli citizenship and those denied citizenship in the occupied territories is blurry, and that for many of them the struggle is one that exists, as campaigners often chant, from the river to the sea. For Israeli politicians, the easiest situation for them at the moment is to continue the status quo. Continue to imply that the more than half a century occupation of Palestinian territory is simply temporary, while continuing to build settlements on the land, blockade and suffocate Gaza, and repress any bursts of Palestinian dissent. This is also something which is tolerable to most Israelis, the majority of whom simply aren't affected by the plight of the Palestinians either directly or on an emotional level. Any change in the status quo, either towards Palestinian sovereignty or towards formalizing apartheid, causes too much anxiety and has too many potential downsides for Israel's politicians to take. And what does this status quo currently mean for the Palestinians? There are currently just under 700,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, in hundreds of settlements protected by the Israeli security services, which cut off Palestinian towns, cities, and villages. The region of the West Bank, designated Area C, makes up 60% of the territory and is under the full control of Israel, rendering the areas under limited Palestinian control a divided archipelago. Palestinians continue to be forced from their homes across the occupied territories, which are then often taken over by settlers who are driven by a religious zeal to settle the land that is referred to in biblical terms as Judea and Samaria. There are more than 700 road obstacles, including 140 checkpoints across the West Bank. There are separate roads that allow Israelis in the illegal settlements to travel into Israel from the occupied territories, avoiding the often hours-long delays that arbitrarily are imposed by the occupation forces on Palestinians. A more than 700-kilometer separation wall, referred to by many Palestinians as the Apartheid Wall, has been constructed by the Israelis across the West Bank since 2002, splitting towns and cities right down the middle, leading to the further confiscation of Palestinian land and cutting them off from schools, farms, social services, and other essentials. Israeli settlements hoard water supplies, leaving hundreds of thousands of Palestinians with limited access to clean water. Israel has actively prevented Palestinians from constructing water infrastructure, while a huge and illegal network has been built for the settlers. Unemployment and poverty are rampant across the territory. While Palestinians living in refugee camps established after the 1948 war are still reliant on the UN Relief Works Agency, an underfunded and often demonized organization. In Gaza, which has been under Israeli and Egyptian siege since 2007, the situation is even more desperate. Gazans, 75% of whom are refugees with origins in villages and towns in Israel from which they were expelled, live lives on the brink. One of the most densely populated areas on Earth, the Gaza Strip's more than 2 million residents have had to endure 4 wars since Hamas took control of the Strip in 2007. Tens of thousands of homes, schools and office buildings have been destroyed, leaving tens of thousands injured, while hundreds of thousands of children are thought to suffer from PTSD. Israel's blockade cuts off Gaza by air, land and sea. Humanitarian aid into the Strip is only allowed under rare circumstances, and access to healthcare, food and fuel has been drastically restricted. A naval blockade imposed by Israel means fishermen are often fired upon by Israeli vessels if they stray too far out to sea, though much of their business is pointless anyway, as the huge quantities of raw, untreated sewage poured into the water mean that more than 60% of the sea is contaminated anyway. Unemployment is perhaps the highest of any area in the world, and poverty is a fact of life for most of the inhabitants of Gaza. More than 95% of the water in Gaza is not potable and has to be purified to be usable. Electricity exists for a few hours a day, and thousands suffer from chronic and infectious diseases which they cannot treat. Overall, between 2008 and 2021, at least 5,739 Palestinians, as well as 251 Israelis, have been killed in fighting. This so-called conflict has killed 23 Palestinians for each Israeli, according to the United Nations, with a far higher proportion of civilian deaths compared to military deaths for the Palestinians compared to the Israelis. So, the status quo for Palestinians is intolerable. And on top of the concrete effects on their day-to-day lives, they suffer from an historic injustice. The native population of Palestine have been expelled from their lands and homes and forced to live under occupation in refugee camps and in exile, and the world for decades has portrayed them as extremists and terrorists and demanded that they make the sacrifices, they make the concessions, they moderate their behavior and their language, and they understand the suffering of their enemies if they want to enjoy the slightest morsel of support for their plight. The fundamental and practical injustices meted out against the Palestinians are now more well known than ever, well publicized and better understood, and the worldwide demonstrations seen during the latest round of violence in Gaza are testament to that. Increasingly, campaigners are abandoning the view of Israel-Palestine as an interstate conflict, and instead seeing it as a question of settler colonialism, a view that was once commonplace among Arab, Jewish and Palestinian political intellectuals, but which was pushed to the sidelines by the Oslo Accords and the promise of a peace process to negotiate a Palestinian state. That is to say that Israel as a state represents the last overt settler colonialist project in the Middle East, designed to disenfranchise the native population at the expense of a privileged national group backed by foreign powers. This is what the theory suggests. The wider recognition of the apartheid assessment comes hand in hand with this and calls for the creation of a state between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea for all of its citizens, regardless of ethnicity or religion, with equal social and democratic rights. Discussions around this are often provoke cries of outrage, as pro-Israel commentators predict disaster and bloodshed for Israeli Jews. Similar fears were expressed prior to the end of apartheid in South Africa, and nothing materialized. But even if the process is messy and unpredictable and unpleasant, fears of a hypothetical future disaster surely can't compare to the maintenance of the current reality for Palestinians. If the US and Israel, the two dominant powers involved in Israel-Palestine, are unwilling to recognize the new reality and genuinely engage in a process to end the disenfranchisement of the Palestinians, then the cause will be led by the Palestinian streets within Israel and the occupied territories, by Hamas and other armed groups through military pressure, and the growing international solidarity movement through direct action demonstrations and boycotts. Unfortunately, under Joe Biden and Naftali Bennett, it's hard to see that the Palestinians have any real partners for peace at the moment.
All right, thank you very much. We're gonna open up for questions now. If you have any questions regarding any of Israel and Palestine, you have to either raise your hand or write in the chat, because you cannot unmute yourself. Everybody's muted and cannot unmute yourself. So I will have to unmute you for you. Yeah. I feel like while people are maybe like gathering their thoughts and questions, I wanted to ask, do you feel like the new government, now that it seems like Netanyahu might be going out, do you feel like, or how do you think Israel's like international relations will change, like with the rest of the Middle East and with the US and Europe?
Well, with the US, well, firstly, I think there has been a lot of attention paid to the idea of Netanyahu leaving, more than has been paid to who's going to replace him. I mean, it's been very easy for people to see Netanyahu as the sort of font of all the problems in Israel and Palestine for the last, God knows how long he's been in power. I can't remember the exact figure, but he's been in power longer than any other Israeli prime minister. So in terms of the US, I imagine there will be an improvement in relations. I mean, part of the problem with the US was personal. Netanyahu's kind of belligerence, his willingness to sort of go beyond diplomatic protocols, such as when he appeared before Republicans in Congress many years ago, sort of implies that there will be, I think, a honeymoon period when kind of more reasonable figures seem to take power in Israel. But I mean, Bennett is, as I mentioned, further to the right on virtually every issue than Netanyahu was. And on top of that, I mean, one factor, of course, he has, which Netanyahu doesn't have, is his commitment to kind of religious law in Israel, whereas Netanyahu is at least a secularist. And so there will be social issues which Bennett will want to push on around things like, gay marriage, for example, which again will probably cause more tensions, particularly with a kind of comparatively liberal US administration. So in terms of the US, I suspect there will be a honeymoon period, but it'll probably all start to degrade again soon. With regards to the Middle East, I don't see any reason. The relationship between Israel and particularly the Arab Gulf states has been effectively the same for many years. It's just that in the last year or so, with the Abraham Accords, they've just made it official and public. And I don't really see any reason why. I don't think there's anyone in the new government who sees the Abraham Accords and the building relations with the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco and so on as being a negative thing. They see that as legitimizing Israel's position in the Middle East. So I don't really see that changing at all, really. I mean, except, of course, the big difference with Bennett, of course, is that unlike Netanyahu, he is pretty vocally and publicly opposed to a Palestinian state. And the countries who signed the Abraham Accords specifically argued that somehow doing these peace deals, quote unquote peace deals with Israel would allow them more leverage over the Israeli government, which is going to seem a bit farcical if you're, trying to negotiate with a government who has very specifically said, we are never going to have a Palestinian state. So there might be some tension there, but fundamentally, I don't think that will change too much.
We have a question here from Jamie and Marta. Let's see if you can unmute yourself.
Hey,
Yes.
yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't change my name. It's only Jamie.
Okay.
First, thank you, Alex, for your talk. It was very informative. It seems like there's, I guess, like a slowly increasing realization internationally of the reality of the situation in Israel-Palestine. But I mean, any change in stance for many governments seems like a really long way off. The US is obviously like a big part of this with their like unequivocal support of Israel. So my question to you is, do you see any way for the international community to pressure Israel into ending their apartheid system without the US on board with it? Or is there unlikely to be any change without US support?
Yeah, well, it's kind of crucial, isn't it? I mean, the US is, China aside, the US is the world's, remaining superpower. So on some level, very little can change in foreign policy without their say so. Look, I mean, the US has always maintained its kind of pivotal sort of importance in everything that happens in Israel-Palestine, despite the fact it's never actually been able to actually be a kind of an impartial adjudicator there. But I mean, the thing which changes politics ultimately is kind of popular pressure. And if you just look at what's been happening in America over the last few years, particularly, I think, in response to some of Trump's sort of more kind of naked pro-Israel sort of campaigning, there is a much bigger movement now for justice for the Palestinians there. And as I said, what's as I sort of mentioned, what's kind of interesting is that among kind of Jewish Americans, the old sort of uncritical support for Israel has sort of dissipated, particularly among younger people. And you're seeing all these groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, and others who have been kind of very vocal in trying to kind of lobby for a change in that on the face of it. And it was and it was very notable that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did come out a few weeks ago and effectively describe Israel as an apartheid state. And of course, she isn't necessarily the mainstream of kind of democratic politics, but she is still very influential, and more people have been sort of shifting on this role. And there's also a question of interest as well. I mean, what does the US ultimately get out of it? I mean, if you're actually having to constantly sort of deal with a belligerent pariah state, ultimately you're gonna be getting very little for bang for your buck, effectively, very little return on the investment. So, I mean, yeah, I think the popular pressure will have some impact eventually.
Any more questions? And I give people a second to write, or yes, Chris. See.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
I may have missed at the beginning if you mentioned anything about what the PLO's response to all this has been, and how do you think it'll affect their political situation with like postponing the vote and moving forward. And then also I may have missed if you said anything about like the PFLP and the leftists in Palestine, what their reaction to all this, and if you think that they can take advantage of the situation to improve their position.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question. Well, so firstly, on the PLO, yeah, I mean, the PLO, it's often easy to overstate kind of apathy towards the PLO in the West Bank. I mean, Palestinians obviously find it quite difficult to let go of an organization which for almost half a century has been, or no, around half a century has been the principal representation of them on Earth. And so there's still some support. There's still some bold support for Fatah, and certainly for some of the more marginalized figures in Fatah and the PLO. But yeah, as a whole, the whole system that's been established in the West Bank through the Palestinian Authority has kind of lost legitimacy in the eyes of many Palestinians, and I think it's the failings of the PA, the failings of Fatah that's led to what we've seen over the last month or so, because they've been virtually invisible. They've had so little input or influence on what's been going on. They've not been able to influence events in Sheikh Jarrah or in Al-Aqsa, in Jerusalem, and obviously Gaza. They were just nowhere to be seen. And Mahmoud Abbas has, he was elected, decades ago almost, and he's lost his legitimacy. He's lost his mandate. He's no longer got a democratic mandate to rule, and therefore he's effectively, a lot of people just see him as being, of the same type as Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt or Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He's simply a kind of dynastic ruler, maybe not dynastic yet because he hasn't got a dynasty yet, but like a ruler who's a ruler for life, who simply uses his position to enrich his own friends and family. I think that's the state of affairs there. The question on the Palestinian left is very interesting, actually, because from what I understand happened. So as you mentioned, there were elections set to take place in April, and they were cancelled ostensibly because Israel wouldn't allow the elections to take place in East Jerusalem. But I think a lot of people saw that as more of an excuse and more a way of avoiding any change in the status quo in the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian left, however, basically, I would say, ended up sort of imitating the behavior of the left virtually everywhere else on earth, which is that they had effectively at some point been trying to negotiate a joint platform for the elections, and involving various groups like the PFLP, the DFLP, the Palestinian People's Party, and some other groups I can't particularly remember the name of. And from what I understand happened, the PFLP objected to I believe it was something to do with the kind of proportionality of the thing, because the PFLP, if anyone doesn't know about the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist-Leninist group who have been around since the 60s, advocate for a socialist republic in Israel-Palestine, and used to be famous for like plane hijackings. They basically argued that as the biggest of the organizations involved in the coalition, they should have some sort of greater kind of say over, the kind of like the positions in any future cabinet and like various other kind of aspects of it. And as a result, the whole thing collapsed. So even if the election had taken place, it was unfortunately another classic example of kind of leftist infighting collapsing the whole thing, which is a pity, because I think you're right that actually if that hadn't happened, if they'd been able to get their act together, they would have been able to take advantage of the situation. I think particularly among kind of younger people who perhaps aren't as enamored, who want to support a kind of progressive hardline against Israel, but who aren't as enamored of Hamas's conservatism, Islamism, and the other issues that goes with that. So yeah, as I said, it's sort of depressing how the strategizing of the left seems to repeat itself around so much of the world in all situations.
Any more questions? Oh yeah, you want to ask another one? Chris? Yes.
Yeah, if no one else is going to, I follow Mr. McDonald's work a lot on the left in Iraq. So this is a little outside of the scope of the topic, but maybe we can bring it in. Just you can answer about the left's response in countries like Iraq to this uprising. Iraq especially, but any other of the countries you cover, I'd be interested to hear what you've heard about the response of left in Lebanon or Iraq or other countries.
Well, I mean, yeah, I have to be honest, I'm not hugely informed about that. As far as I know, most of the statements they put out are generally the same as before. I mean, the problem with the left in Iraq and in Lebanon, most of the rest of the Middle East, is they don't actually have much power, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, this, you know, the standard position has been the same for a very long time, which is pro-Palestinian. Yeah, sorry, I mean, I don't have anything kind of more insightful to say than that. Yeah, I mean, so the Iraqi Communist Party put out the usual sort of supportive statements. I mean, one angle I might mention on that, with regards to Iraq, of course, is how there was some tension over the fact that one of the groups who are kind of most avowedly or publicly pro-Palestinian there were all the various kind of Iran-backed organizations and things like the Sadrist movement, and I saw among sort of the kind of the democracy activists and like some Communist Party activists, I suppose, some tension over the fact that like there was kind of criticism from the kind of pro-Iran groups of the fact that these guys were criticizing the pro-Iran groups and saw them as sort of a threat in Iraq, while Gaza was being bombed. It was sort of implied a certain degree of sort of I suppose treachery on the part of the kind of democracy activists in Iraq, that they were criticizing what is often referred to as the resistance, who, you know, against Israel or whatever, while at the same time claiming to be pro-Palestinian. So that was that's an interesting element of tension there. But I mean, you know, in practice, there was no, you know, the left's position across most of these countries is the same as it always has been, which is, you know, supportive of the Palestinians and obviously supportive of the kind of more progressive elements within Palestine.
More questions? Doesn't seem like it. No? Yeah. Maybe we should call it there then. Yeah. I want to thank you very much, Alex McDonald, for coming today.
No problem.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, with that, I just want to say this is the last lecture for UF Malmo for this semester. We will be back next semester. Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you again very much, Alex McDonald, for coming. Great to have you.
No problem.
All right. Bye, guys. See ya.